wanted to begin thinking in terms of these three nations where I've had the sort of privilege to do some storytelling: Venezuela, Mexico, and Cuba, and try and break down for you as best as I can some of the challenges involved in operating in those nations, which are obviously very different in all sorts of ways. But I do think there are lessons that we can learn that kind of apply to working in all three of those very different environments, and can inform the storytelling that we do while we're there, so that we can lift the quality of the work that we produce in Venezuela, in Mexico, and Cuba. Each has their own kind of pushes and pulls on you as a journalist. Each have their own stresses and strains on you as a journalist, whether or not that's to do with kind of some of the day-to-day stuff of life, or to do with some of the things we might be writing or producing or trying to film or trying to record. There are a lot of elements that we need to bear in mind. I mean, clearly, we only need to think about kind of Venezuela's context: largest proven oil reserves in the world, yet currently going through one of the biggest crises in the region. Queues around the block for basic goods, spiraling violence, hyperinflation, a very antagonistic government towards doing journalism. To give us a sense of just how complex it can be to operate down there. And of course, it's well documented some of Mexico's difficulties, and of course, working in Cuba, again, it's a complex relationship with the government. So each of these has their differences. But like I say, I think that the better we get at knowing what some of these pitfalls are, the more we can add to the rich storytelling tradition from that part of these parts of Latin America, and from Latin America as a region as a whole. And that is uniquely important at the moment, partly because of some of these issues that I've just quickly sort of put a couple of photos up to illustrate, but also because of the kind of wealth of interesting stories that are available down there that are make up the daily life around these big narratives, if you like. The narrative of Venezuela going wrong. Well, these are people's lives, and we want to try and explain best possible the humanity that is, affected by what's happening. So I'm just going to cue up a very short little video. I'm afraid it's a bit, about me, but that wasn't my intention. It's just the kind of access to the materials I had. So I've taken two videos and a little piece of radio from each of these nations. So one from Mexico, one from Venezuela, and one from and a little bit of radio from Cuba, just to begin to spark some ideas about the sorts of challenges we meet in these countries. I think because I'm going to start with the Mexico one, I should explain where it comes in. It's not the full video. It's not the full piece that went on TV. So you've got a truncated version. So if it looks like it's lacking some context, well, that's because it is, and that's true of all of them. There is a whole rest of the video to go. It will be a balanced piece if it's seen in its whole. So I've just snipped them up. But this particular one, which will start in Spanish, which will start in Mexico, is about a local crime reporter called Eli in the city of Coatzacoalcos in Veracruz. And we wanted to do something about just how dangerous it is for local journalists to operate in Mexico. Today is World Press Freedoms Day, as I'm sure you all know, and it's worth taking a moment to appreciate just how dangerous it is for local journalists to operate in Mexico. By and large, Western foreign journalists haven't been hurt, haven't been affected beyond intimidation, often quite frightening intimidation in Mexico and Central America. But there are scores of local journalists who have been killed in the name of our work. and are continue to be killed. The impunity rate is somewhere around 98% on those murders. And, you know, as recently as a month ago, I believe, there was another murder took place in Mexico. So it's something that's in the forefront of your mind when you're a journalist in Mexico, that maybe it might not happen to you if you're lucky. You're not doing an investigative piece that's going to upset the drug cartels, but you can be damn sure some of the people you're working with are doing that and are running the risk of falling on the wrong side of these people all the time. And you're often leaning on them for support. You're often leaning on them for local contacts, for stories, for local context. So that's really how we decided to illustrate the difficulties of being a journalist in Veracruz. There's no voiceover to the Spanish, for which you'll excuse me, because this is from the raw, but yeah, it should still hopefully be pretty straightforward to understand.
Elia Viña presents The Breakfast Show on her local radio station. The headlines include a bank robbery, a quiet night for drug cartel violence, and the possible extradition of a former state governor. These are normal stories for Veracruz, one of the most violent states in Mexico. After the show, Ellie shows me a few stories she's covered recently. From shootouts to funerals, they all share one theme: the turf war raging between two main cartels in the region, the Zetas and the Jalisco Nueva Generación.
Un muerto diario es poco. A veces ha habido hasta 3 o 4 y tenemos que ir. Para ello, entre compañeros hemos hecho lazos de unión. A veces los medios te piden exclusividad, ¿no?
The most recent example was a gruesome mass killing on the outskirts of the town. Ellie took us back to the crime scene.
These are the stories that local journalists run most risks when reporting. An entire family, including 4 children, were murdered in their home by unknown gunmen. The youngest victim just 3 years old. Unfortunately, such events are becoming part of daily life in Veracruz, and as such an increasing part of a reporter's job.
While covering it, Ellie says she was intimidated by a police officer, and when she complained, she received a death threat online.
Me dio miedo, obviamente, y bajé mis redes sociales, mi Twitter, Facebook, todo. Fotografías, todo.
Many Mexican journalists have paid the ultimate price for reporting on the drug cartels, like well-known reporter Javier Valdez, gunned down in May outside his office. But the dangers of reporting the drug war don't just come from the cartels, also from corrupt elements of the security forces. In some states, say campaigners, they are one and the same thing.
When you kill a journalist such as Javier Valdez, you are killing a messenger, and that in order for him to become the message.
Back in Veracruz, it has been a day without drug violence for Elia Viña. Instead, she spent the afternoon on a report about abandoned vehicles, stories local journalists used to write before the drug war worsened. These days, though, the murder of colleagues is increasingly part of the job.
La verdad es que a veces nos sentamos y decimos, ¿qué es lo que más podemos hacer si nos siguen matando?
With a young family to think about, Ellie doesn't want to die for her profession. So she tries to tread the most careful path she can, while still reporting truthfully about the state of Veracruz. Will Grant, BBC News, Coatzacoalcos, Mexico.
So, you know, that's really there just to kind of give us an impression in each country of all of the different kinds of experiences you will come up against when operating there. Clearly in Venezuela, that was a moment of high tension on the streets. We're talking, you know, rubber bullets coming in one direction, Molotov cocktails coming in the other. That is, you know, a reality that lasted for weeks on end down in Caracas and claimed the lives of a lot of young people. The situation in Mexico, much more low-key, and the story went on to show how Ellie was threatened by the security forces for filming that story. She was filmed by them as she was simply doing her job, and then denounced on social media by a fake account. Threatening stuff with a sort of essentially a death threat. You know, that is extremely frightening, and she's barely 25, 27, something like that. So, and of course, Fidel. Why did I put that in the end? Well, because I just want you to think about just how sensitive that moment was in Cuba and how complex it can be to get it right. You know, the authorities were watching very closely the way we were doing our job over those particular weeks. And we needed to make sure that we played it very straight, as they say in cricket. You know, you play a very straight bat. You don't want to get that one wrong, because they're going to take a very dim view of it. We're not there to say Fidel Castro was a wonderful leader who did everything right, nor are we there to ape the line coming out of Miami and say that he was a brutal dictator. It's not the BBC's job, nor should it be necessarily your job when you go there, depending on how you perceive journalism. But the journalism that I understand is very much about independence, clarity, objectivity as much as we can do, and stepping aside so that the reporter isn't in the way of the storytelling and allowing that storytelling to take place without passing through you as the filter as much as possible. So I'm just going to go back to something that I was shown when I did my degree, which wasn't in geography. I given it away. Which wasn't in journalism, but was in geography. And this particular gentleman, Eratosthenes, who was a Greek mathematician and the chief librarian in Alexandria. And I think he is extremely cool. He might resemble Jeremy Corbyn, but that's neither here nor there. He was the father of geography. And as I say there, the first person to calculate, apparently pretty accurately, the circumference of the Earth. But this is the bit that really stood out to me when it was pointed out to me in kind of Geography 101 at Edinburgh, was that he came up as the father of geography with the word geography. And geography, as I understand it, as it is a literal translation of geo, earth, graphy, writing. And I think really that sort of has underpinned everything that I've tried to do subsequently, that the journalistic kind of tools, it doesn't matter whether or not you're in data mapping or kind of you're interested in peoples and cultures and societies. I think there are real connections between geography that, in a sense, that all we are trying to do as journalists is write about the Earth as we understand it. The societies we meet, the cultures we come into, the people we encounter, the economies that we experience. And to me, that was quite a sort of profound understanding, and definitely one that has really helped me understand what our role as journalists is, that we're involved in really the storytelling. I guess that's why we constantly call them news stories. It's the storytelling. It's the writing about the Earth as we encounter it. And there are some very, very cool things within that. Just down the road in Berkeley, the very, very important historical geography of Latin America in the Berkeley School of Geography. So while this isn't intended to be a geography lecture, not by a long way, I do think there are some key crossovers between the two disciplines. The understanding of a person's physical or geographical context informs, where we are in terms of their societies. So why does any of that really matter about the way we work in Latin America? And I think we can break down the challenges that I was referring to in two key broad ideas. They are basically practical, as far as I can see. Practical, and I'm talking about the daily concerns and the issues of doing the job on a day-to-day basis. And then editorial, the pressures that are put on us to produce unbiased reporting as best we can. I've broken it down into these two categories for simplicity's sake. And I really want to emphasize that they're not mutually exclusive, that there's a great deal of crossover. There will be editorial problems and questions that involve a key logistic element, that the sheer logistics affect our editorial capabilities, that what we can do is affecting how we do it. So a quick example, almost all the foreign media in Cuba is based in a government building. So, that means that they decide what happens in that building. They can, for example, switch off the internet if they wanted to, and we would all be stuck. So you know what I mean? These are both editorial and practical ideas. And I remember shortly after I got there, the BBC invited a dissident to go live from this live spot in our office. That I didn't realize was frowned upon, that you kind of need to speak to dissidents on the telephone or something like that, or get them out of Miami. I didn't really realize that rule, and so it didn't take long before somebody brought it up with me from the powers that be. So these are the sorts of kind of like, that's both a logistical thing, because it's to do with, the space, but it is quite clearly editorial if we are under pressures about where we can put people and who we can speak to and under what conditions. But nevertheless, I do think that it helps broadly with our understandings to think of these two major categories, the practicalities on the one hand and the editorialities, as it were, on the other. So if we break them down country by country a little bit, and we think about Cuba's practicalities, anyone who's been there, and hopefully there's quite a few people in the room who have, will immediately know about number one, the lack of internet access, and just how frustrating that can be. As a journalist, it can be more than just frustrating. It can stop you doing your job. We who are based there are able to depend on internet connections. We're permitted to have decent internet connections, both in our offices and our homes. But you who might be coming in with a visa to be there for 5 days will need to know that internet is more than just an inconvenience. It's a real issue. If you're on deadline, and you've got to file a hefty piece of radio or a weighty piece of TV, a big file, you need to be thinking that you're not, I think I've got some on me, and I showed these in one of the classes earlier, which are the way that you get online in Cuba, which is through public access Wi-Fi spots with these scratch cards, which allow you an hour's worth of internet, and they're about $2 each. And that's well down on what it used to be. That's how all Cubans get onto the internet. And you, as a visiting journalist, would have very few options except to stock up on these cards and scratch them out as like crazy, trying to send your, and if you're on deadline, that's obviously quite stressful. So, again, this is a practicality thing, because it also then feeds into other stuff. Skype's blocked, so you can't Skype your family if you need to do that. Or beyond Skyping your family, what about when they say, can you do us a live on that? Well, the office, I'm not going to get there for the top of the hour. But it's also all right, just do it on Skype, as BBC World does quite often. Well, no, I've said this 1,000 times, it's blocked. And people don't realize that quite a lot of US software will be blocked because the company behind it doesn't want to run foul of the US economic embargo. So, hopefully, brings me to the next point, which is the US economic embargo. And that is a whole swathe of practical difficulties. Finding stuff, getting hold of replacement parts, new tripods, a decent camera, your microphone's broken, you need batteries, you need new trainers, you have children and they need nappies. It is that kind of degree of hassle all the time, all year round, constantly for 57 years. So there is a real element there that people aren't able to appreciate until they go to Cuba, but it's informing our journalism. And of course, again, it's an editorial issue that we can talk about a little later. But it's editorial in the sense that it is extremely important to the Cuban government that is reflected in the coverage of why their economy is at times on its knees, or it's at the best stagnant. Of course, that's not the only reason. And so where do you put the weighting? Because certainly there are people who believe that it's used as an excuse to explain poor economic decision making. But you need to recognize that it is a reality too. Bureaucracy, or what's called the bloqueo interno sometimes, Fidel used that term, meaning the internal embargo, i.e. that yes, the embargo causes hassles, but it has to be acknowledged that Cuba causes caused its own hassles by having these layers and layers and layers of bureaucracy, common across Latin America, of course, for those who've been there, common across many news organizations, if I'm perfectly honest, and probably most universities too, that you have to fill in everything in triplicate. But in Cuba, it is, stratospheric, the degree of kind of officialdom and administration and of queuing to get to the bank, only to find that when you get there that the electricity is down and you can't, and there's no internet connection even in the first place. So, you're beginning to already feel that this is quite a stodgy place to work. Things don't flow like they do in Germany, needless to say. I mean, very few places do, but I mean, they don't even flow like they do in Mexico. So, I mean, it can be hectic. It can be crumbling infrastructure. And, that is a serious thing. Cars, finding replacement cars. A journalist friend had a very, very close call with a car because the brakes just stopped working. And as far as he was concerned, it was in okay shape. But when eventually they looked at it, they're saying, this should have been sorted out years ago. But it was the company car. So, the things aren't necessarily kept up. And while, that could be true of all sorts of places, in Cuba it's kind of the norm rather than the exception. That, it can be quite exhausting to be around that situation. It can be quite dangerous, particularly in hurricane season. So when Hurricane Irma came through, we were out without electricity for 6 whole days, no water. I know that's nothing compared to the poor people in Puerto Rico, which went on for 6 whole months or longer. But, in that time, you're still expected to file on the story. One thing is being without electricity while it's a real drag and a real pain because you can't, take a shower and you can't switch on the, you're losing food because, the fridges aren't on, but the government's working to get it back as best possible. Quite another thing is being without electricity when you're supposed to be filing on this thing and you're supposed to be like live in front of a satellite link up of some description. So, just to have these sorts of things in mind, because with a bit of luck, if this is the kind of work you want to do, you may well find yourself in a place that, like Cuba, in a hurricane season, and it might just trigger the things that, remind you that, you can't just turn up with a kind of Gore-Tex on. You need to be thinking kind of broader than that. Mexico, and quite obviously with Mexico, I mean, it doesn't need saying, but the personal security, this is the most violent country in the world for journalists outside a war zone. And, I mentioned that, and you saw the report with Ellie, but it is an all-pervasive problem in Mexico as a journalist, and we need to be hyper aware of it because, there are real consequences for people we care about. And most journalists in Mexico can name 2 or 3 that they know who have lost their lives, or I say lost their lives, have been gunned down. And I think particularly it's that thing where you don't necessarily think it's a kind of an editor's job, but actually no, it's the entire team's job to worry about, is the driver okay? Is the fixer okay? Will their families be put in a difficult position if we go to that particular neighborhood and we try and do that particular story? So it's about constantly kind of thinking through the difficulties that are involved. And I say their drug cartels' power or reach, just to sort of underline that there are parts of Mexico where really the cartels and the state cannot be divided. The line between them isn't just fine, it's non-existent. It is a policeman by day, but a drug cartel member at night. And that is a reality in whole swathes of Mexico, Tamaulipas, Veracruz, Guerrero, big problems where the accusation of being a narco-estado is not like a narco-state, is not kind of a cheap thing that's just been thrown away by opposition. It's true. There are municipalities where the drug cartels and the mayor, for example, are absolutely one and the same. And you need to know when you're going into those areas, how long you're going to be there, who you're going in with, how well versed have you been about the risk of going to this place? Is this story worth it? Which kind of really, it's about similarly, corruption and the police, I mean, that's broadly a similar thing. It could be as small as having your car stopped and knowing that you may be asked for money. That might not be that big a deal. You may get out of the situation quite quickly, but it's about not being shocked if that happens, not being caught off guard, not being frightened, because it can be, and if weakness is picked up on, then, they will focus in on that. Earthquakes and natural disasters. We spoke just about the hurricane season. When I was doing, so we did Hurricane Irma, and then I went to Puerto Rico and we did Hurricane Maria. And while I was there was the earthquake in Mexico, and I flew to Mexico City, and we picked up that story from the guys who were there, and I took over after they'd finished the first week. It was the most insane month I could have possibly have imagined, and a lot of death, and it's quite harrowing. But, it's something to bear in mind. You may either go there as a journalist, you may be based there as a journalist, and if you are based there as a journalist, do you want to be based in a hurricane, in an earthquake region? It's something to bear in mind. Some people would be put off from that very idea. But all of this really is boiling down to this ultimate point, which is that these are hostile environments, and as I say, particularly places like Veracruz, Sinaloa, and Tamaulipas. Now, the BBC, I'm lucky to say, take this stuff pretty seriously. They send us on these courses where we get a certain degree of first aid, where we think about all these issues, where they fake kidnap us and they kind of put us into kind of stress situations, and we're tested on kind of how we deal with them. And we have a refresher every few years. There may be an element that's simply for the BBC's insurance policy, which is fair, but it's also because they want to they feel a real duty of care towards us as their journalists. And I think, again, Venezuela will kind of cross over with quite a few of those points. It is an extremely hostile environment, particularly in Venezuela at the moment. The hyperinflation. You cannot take out more than essentially, I think it's something like $3 or less maybe from the cash machines at the moment. And when you take it out, it's a wad of cash about that big. And so everything operates in the black market, and it's extremely complicated, and it's illegal. And so you're on the margins of legality right from the moment you step into the country. So that can be difficult. The violence you saw in the little clip, but that's the violence, that's political violence with Molotov cocktails. There's the daily violence of going to the shanty towns and people killing each other on an extraordinary level, to an extremely, constant problem. Demonstrations, again, you saw that. Infrastructure, water shortages, blackouts, just you name it. Venezuela is going through a tough time at the moment. But that was true when I was there in 2008 already. Venezuela obviously has these huge, vast oil reserves, but it actually makes all of its energy, domestic energy consumption is from hydroelectric. So when there's a drought, suddenly all the lights go off. So you have this very strange situation where the country with the biggest proven oil reserves in the world can't switch its lights on. And it's, it gets people very angry, agitated, which brings us back to the violent protests. It's like a cyclical thing at the moment. The traffic and the roads, I mean, people drive like it's insanity. They drink a lot and drive, and that's not getting any better as far as I can see. And so again, personal safety, hostile environment. Like I say, the broad point about these courses is that I think quite often freelancers end up overlooking them a bit because they're expensive to go on. You kind of need somebody to sponsor you. And I think friends of mine, journalists, think I'm a bit overzealous about them, that I've sort of insisted that people have them, and I've tried to get money out of the BBC to send freelancers we've worked with to go and do them. But that's partly because I found it absolutely unconscionable that big organizations, and I include places like El País, El Mundo, other big media outlets, would actually, and plenty of them who really could not claim there was a lack of a budget was a problem. They had enough money to pay for stories, weren't sending their young journalists on these courses. Now, I'm not saying these courses would necessarily save your life, but I carry this little thing with me all the time. and refer to it from time to time. And it's just good to know that the knowledge is there, that your company, if they ever had to speak to your parents, and God forbid that they would ever have to any of us, can look them in the eye and say, well, we did all we could. We measured the risks, and, measuring the risks, they went and did the story, and, it was a terrible accident. But it's having the knowledge before you go in. I know that's pretty depressing thought, but it is, no one will really look out for your life except for you. So I think those are just some of the practicalities, and this is that other category, the editorial. And rather than go through them one by one, I thought I'd just sort of point out that they actually share some real similarities. What are the similarities between those three nations? Well, first off, that there are major political extremes. And I know that's true of, say, Brazil as well, or other parts of the world, but it is absolutely the case, or even maybe this nation at the moment, that is quite increasingly polarized. But certainly, if you look at Mexico, Venezuela, and Cuba, they're made up of a political system that kind of pushes people to the margins, to take very radical pro or anti positions. In the case of Cuba, for example, the anti is by and large not on the island, or at least the organized anti-voice, the one that makes up a kind of anti-Castro kind of bloc, tends to be in Florida. But that's to say that they will come and squeeze your work one way or the other if they think that you're representing the opposite of the truth, that you are somehow too far pro or too far anti. Venezuela, it's essentially the same issue. In many ways, even more so, because unlike Cuba, where that block of opposing voices or critics is outside the island, in Cuba they live cheek to jowl. They're next door to each other. They're right on each other, and they're unhappy, and it's on the streets. So in a sense, it's even more marked. Strongman or caudillo. So again, all of these nations can mark, as far as I can see, a kind of history of caudillismo. Fidel Castro, Raúl Castro, Hugo Chavez. Again, Mexico was described as the perfect dictatorship by Mario Vargas Llosa. And what he meant by that, I think, was that the dominant party there, just passed power to itself for 80 years. And it's actually, the politics was not the important thing, it was maintaining power. So, those are difficult environments under which to exercise decent journalism, because these are powerful men, and crossing them in the wrong way can be quite detrimental. And coming with that is something that those men often engender, which is a siege mentality, that everybody's against us, it's us against the world. Everybody wants to bring down Venezuela, but we'll show them. That kind of viewpoint, and that is engendered by the leadership in many countries. You are part of the problem, right? You are here to undermine even, and how dare you have the audacity to come here and undermine our beautiful project, which you can't understand with your white Western ways. So, again, these are real kind of issues that I certainly have been on the receiving end of, live to the nation with Chavez, mocked, on state TV, and then off the back of that, you're supposed to go up to the pro-Chavez areas or whatever it might be and kind of have reasoned debates. But they saw you on TV yesterday. And it's like, oye, tú, who are you? And well, we saw you saying terrible things, whereas really all you were doing were asking the difficult questions that the state media would never ask. So you're putting yourself in an uncomfortable place from the get-go. There's a real fear. And now what I mean about that is the fear of the guests and the people you'll be talking to of deviating from the official script. So they want to echo what they're supposed to be saying, or what the leadership says, what the caudillos have said. And so you're wondering if what you've got on tape is really that valuable, because it's just regurgitated revolutionary slogans. And there is a genuine fear of real retribution, or, in the case of Mexico, consequences from the cartels. So people are scared with reason is not that they're scared just because they're scared. No, they're scared because they've seen stuff happen to their neighbors. They've seen stuff happen in their workplace to their colleagues. So, you have to be really aware that you're asking quite a lot of people. You live, and I'm from, a culture that is kind of expects people to kind of, I'll talk to the BBC, of course. I'd be overjoyed to. Come, sit down. And you will, encounter that in the field. Of course you will. But you might not. And when you don't, and you do come across this fear, it's important to take it really seriously because it's rarely misplaced. And as somebody often points out to me, what is in it for these people to talk to you? Like, what do they get out of it? Sometimes the answer is very, very little. So we need to be aware of that. Surveillance. And I've just sort of said that there's a kind of balance to be had here between paranoia and living under this constant fear that your phone's being tapped and your office is tapped and your car's tapped and your home is watched and this guy's following you, and actually self-preservation because, frankly, they might be. And sort of getting that balance right of being aware that surveillance is a tool in many of these nations. And again, I'm not trying to just say in just Cuba or just Venezuela or just Mexico, as it's been made clear that the NSA and all sorts of other people are listening to all sorts of people. But targeting journalists for being journalists is an issue. And you need to balance going mad with paranoia with being aware. So some people do stuff like encrypt their emails or just constantly have that in the backs of their minds that, you want to be careful because, what you're saying will be read somewhere by someone. And again, all of that leads to an attempt at censorship or self-censorship, so that these tools of intimidation are kind of being done in order to make sure that the pen hovers slightly before it writes. So that you go, do I say it like this, or would I be smarter saying it like that? Which clips here do I use? Sometimes not to protect me, but to protect the interviewee, to protect that person who is bold enough to talk to you, despite the fact that talking to the media isn't encouraged. So, we've done things like there was a suggestion that there was a real dissent within the military in Venezuela, and we found a reasonably high-up officer who was prepared to say there was. But we were all understanding that we were going to film this very carefully, just show his hands, not make clear which even city in the country we were interviewing him, call him Pedro, invent a name, look after him, because he has to stay there. And we're the one who just swoop in and can leave. So, these are some of the ideas that occurred to me. And this is something that one of my bosses said when I was coming out here. And I just wanted to kind of draw on it. I mean, he sort of said the biggest challenge, as he could see in Cuba and Venezuela, is that they see dissent from the government line as at best unpatriotic and at worst counter-revolutionary. That creates problems both for our foreign correspondents and the local staff who work with them. And I think, he also made another point, was that the foreign correspondent needs to approach the story from the point of view of understanding what motivates the government's decision to silence dissent. We must work within the legal boundaries placed upon us in terms of the ease of movement, but we need to report to our audience where those restrictions hamper our ability to properly report what is happening. So we should never shy away from saying things that need to be said because of fear of having our operation shut down, because there's no point being somewhere if you can't report honestly on events. But we should also not take the hostility towards our profession personally and let it taint our coverage. And I thought that was a really good way of summarizing a lot of what I'm trying to get at here. It's that, they have the reasons for, in some cases, for bringing these pressure on journalists and journalism. And there may be times where you need to kind of reveal what's behind the curtain and show the little man pulling the levers. So you need to be careful when you do that. But I've certainly in my script said, so-and-so who was just echoing the party line, or school children as they were watched by their head teacher. Stuff like this to make it clear that there is a degree of control going on here. So as he says, we need to weigh up when we're being pressured into a certain position and when we can kind of let the story speak for itself, when we need to reveal just how bad it's hampering our ability to be there. And then in terms of big news organizations, take a decision whether or not it's worth staying there at all if we can't do our job properly. And then I believe, just to finish, there are some issues that might affect you in ways that they don't affect me if you are US journalists. And there are some small things like the travel and visa rules are different often for Americans than they are for Brits or for Europeans or for other Latin Americans. Venezuela is a good example of that at the moment. You'll find it extremely difficult to go to Venezuela as an American, whereas I would hope to go for the upcoming elections as a Brit. So, those are sorts of hassles that could be different. Hostility, will there be that sort of thing that you're under the cosh because you're an American, because your president said this, that I might be able to deflect a bit more because I'm a different type of gringo, So these are kind of things. Does it almost, conversely, sometimes offer you more of a degree of protection as well? Are you actually protected better by being Americans? i.e., kicking out American media of Cuba would be a huge step for Cuba, and one that particularly when things were going well with Obama, they would not have wanted to do. So would you perhaps get a certain degree of support from the foreign ministry in Cuba that perhaps other Spanish, French outlets wouldn't be able to get because the relationship was getting better? They wanted perhaps the New York Times to be there or whatever it might be. US audiences will be consuming and thinking about all of these issues in ways that are different. And I have US audiences, we work with US audiences, but you will know them better than I. You will be able to know your audience and how all of these issues that we've been through affect your reportage, the sorts of things that you're sending back to those audiences. And like I say, just this idea that you are somehow linked to Washington policy is not something that I have to worry about in quite the same way. So, be aware of that. If Washington policy gets particularly hostile towards an area where you're based, that can lead to real headaches for the US-based, the US-born reporters. And then this really is just to say that it is quite honestly the coolest job in the world. I mean, I love what I do. I've been really privileged to cover some incredible stories from, yaks out in kind of tobacco growing country to the Rolling Stones to whatever it might be, Caracas. But really, it is an extraordinary privilege to be in the field. To be in the field in those three countries, definitely. But to be in the field in a region that is kind of at an interesting moment. It's at the cusp of something. Its relationship with Washington is, again, difficult. Its relationship internally with all the different nations is very, very complex at the moment in Latin America. The oil situation in Venezuela is at a critical point. And what does that mean for what was this supposed pink tide of left-wing leaders in Latin America? Will that run out of steam now? It's causing real hassles for Colombia. The biggest exodus of people outside Syria is Venezuelans at the moment. So the stories are strong and they need representing by good journalists. So we need to go in with the very, very, very best set of kind of skills that we can muster when we go down there, do the most responsible journalism we can do when we're in country, and try and let the stories tell themselves, be conduits for the stories and not come in with our own preconceived values. And if any of the stuff that went before helps in that endeavor, well, hopefully this has been useful in that regard, to try and kind of understand some of the challenges you might meet along the way if you end up doing some of that kind of journalism. And I encourage you to do so because it is very, very cool journalism to do. So yeah, that's my speech.